George Washington, first president and father of a nation, 1732 to 1799. The year is 1789. April 30th. In New York City, on the balcony of Federal Hall, a man stands before a gathered crowd that stretches as far as the eye can see. He is 57 years old. His hair, though powdered white in the fashion of the age, conceals the red-brown beneath. He stands 6 feet 2 inches tall, towering for his era, with broad shoulders that speak of years spent surveying wilderness and commanding armies. His hands, large and scarred from decades of physical labor and warfare, rest upon a Bible. The air is electric with anticipation. Church bells ring across the city. In the harbor, ships fire their cannons in celebration. But the man on the balcony feels something other than triumph. Those who stand close enough to see his face note the gravity etched into his features, the weight visible in his gray-blue eyes. He has spent 8 years leading an army of farmers and merchants against the most powerful military force on earth. He has won that impossible war. He has watched his soldiers starve at Valley Forge, seen them bleed at Monmouth, held dying boys in his arms at Yorktown. He has retired to his beloved plantation, believing his service complete. And now, reluctantly, he has been called back. The oath is administered. He places his hand upon the Bible. The words he speaks are simple, prescribed by the Constitution ratified less than 2 years prior. But in speaking them, he transforms. No longer simply a general or a planter. He becomes the first president of the United States, a position that does not yet have definition, precedent, or even a clear understanding of its powers. When he finishes, he adds words not required by law. So help me God. Then he bends forward and kisses the Bible. The crowd erupts, but Washington's face remains solemn. He knows what others cannot yet fully grasp, that every decision he makes, every precedent he sets, will echo through generations. There is no map for what comes next, no previous president to consult, no established customs to follow. He is about to invent the American presidency, and the weight of that responsibility, on this bright spring morning, settles upon him like armor he can never remove. Birth into a changing world. He enters the world on February 22nd, 1732, according to the calendar we use today, though by the calendar of his birth, the date reads February 11th, 1731. The discrepancy matters less than the place. A plantation called Pope's Creek, on the banks of the Potomac River in Westmoreland County, Virginia. His father, Augustine Washington, is a tobacco planter of moderate wealth and ambition. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, is Augustine's second wife, a strong-willed woman whose relationship with her firstborn son will remain complicated until her death. The Virginia of George Washington's childhood is not yet the romantic South of later imagination. It is a rough frontier society where fortunes are made and lost in tobacco crops, where malaria lurks in every swamp, where the line between civilization and wilderness remains thin and contested. The great plantation houses are fewer than legend suggests. Most planters, including the Washingtons, live in modest wooden structures, fighting constantly against the elements and economic uncertainty. Young George is not born into the Virginia aristocracy. He is born into its striving middle class. Families with land and slaves, yes, but also with debts, uncertain futures, and the constant need to prove themselves worthy of respect. This distinction will shape everything that follows. When George is 11 years old, his father dies. The death shatters the family's economic security. The best lands and resources go to George's older half-brothers from Augustine's first marriage. George inherits Ferry Farm, a modest property across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg, and 10 slaves. It is not enough to secure a gentleman's future. There will be no education in England, as his half-brothers received. No university at all. Instead, there will be surveying chains, wilderness camps, and the slow, grinding work of making himself into something more than his inheritance suggests he should be. The education of a surveyor. At 15, George Washington becomes a surveyor. It is not his first choice. He dreams of joining the Royal Navy, but his mother forbids it, but it proves formative. He learns to read the land, to calculate distances and boundaries with mathematical precision, to sleep rough in forests where bears and hostile Indians present constant danger. The work requires physical endurance, mental discipline, and an ability to navigate between competing claims and interests. The Shenandoah Valley, where much of his surveying takes place, is raw country. German and Scots-Irish settlers are pushing into lands that the Iroquois and other tribes consider their own. Violence erupts regularly. Washington encounters this frontier reality firsthand. The burned cabins, the fresh graves, the constant tension between expansion and survival. But surveying provides something beyond practical skills. It brings him into contact with the Fairfax family, the most powerful clan in Northern Virginia. Through their patronage, young Washington begins to understand how power operates in colonial society. Connections matter. Reputation matters. Land, vast quantities of land, matters most of all. He begins acquiring property wherever he can, understanding that land is the foundation of wealth and status in this tobacco-dependent economy. By his late teens, Washington stands over 6 feet tall, weighs nearly 200 pounds, and possesses a physical strength that becomes legendary. Stories circulate about his ability to throw stones across the Rappahannock, to break horses, to endure hardships that would break other men. But it is not merely his physique that draws attention. It is his bearing. Despite his youth and limited formal education, he carries himself with a dignity that suggests future importance. He is learning to project authority before he truly possesses it, a skill that will serve him throughout his life. Trial by wilderness. In October 1753, Washington receives an assignment that will change his trajectory. Robert Dinwiddie, Virginia's lieutenant governor, needs someone to deliver an ultimatum to the French forces building forts in the Ohio country. The mission requires traveling hundreds of miles through winter wilderness into contested territory where English authority means little. Most sensible men would decline. Washington, at 21, accepts immediately. The journey nearly kills him. He encounters hostile French officers who smile politely while making clear they have no intention of withdrawing. He survives an Indian guide's attempt to assassinate him at close range. He falls from a raft into the ice-choked Allegheny River and barely makes it to shore before hypothermia sets in. When he finally returns to Williamsburg after 11 weeks, half frozen and exhausted, he has gained something valuable, a reputation for courage and reliability. That reputation leads directly to military command. In 1754, Virginia sends Washington back to the Ohio country with a small military force. He is 22 years old and has never commanded troops in battle. What follows is a disaster. At a place called Jumonville Glen, his forces kill a French diplomatic party in circumstances that remain disputed to this day. The French call it murder. Washington calls it a military engagement. The truth likely falls somewhere between. Weeks later, at Fort Necessity, French forces and their Indian allies surround Washington's position. After a day-long battle fought in driving rain, with his men exhausted and his ammunition depleted, Washington surrenders. He signs a document written in French, a language he does not fully understand, that contains a confession to assassinating the French officer at Jumonville Glen. When he realizes what he has signed, it is too late. The document will be used as propaganda to justify French military actions throughout the conflict that follows. He returns to Virginia in disgrace. But here, something remarkable happens. Rather than ending his career, the defeats somehow enhance his reputation. He has shown courage under fire. He has led men in combat. He has survived where others might have crumbled. And, importantly, he has learned from his mistakes. The crucible of war. The French and Indian War expands into a global conflict. Washington rejoins the military as an aide to General Edward Braddock, the British commander sent to drive the French from the Ohio country. In July 1755, near Fort Duquesne, Braddock's force marches into an ambush. French and Indian fighters, hidden in the forest, tear the British column apart. Braddock is mortally wounded. Officers fall like wheat before a scythe. Washington, though sick with dysentery, rallies the surviving troops, organizing a fighting retreat that prevents total annihilation. 2 horses are shot from under him, for musket balls pierce his coat, but he remains untouched by enemy fire. The experience reinforces a belief that will stay with him throughout his life, that Providence watches over him, preserving him for some larger purpose. For the next 3 years, he commands the Virginia Regiment, defending the colony's frontier against Indian raids. The work is brutal and often thankless. He learns to manage soldiers, to maintain discipline, to make impossible decisions about which settlements can be defended and which must be abandoned. He learns that war is not glory but grinding, patient, often futile effort against enemies who refuse to fight by European rules. By 1758, at 26, Washington has had enough. He resigns his commission, having grown frustrated with British attitudes toward colonial officers and exhausted by years of frontier service. He returns to civilian life, intent on building his fortune and establishing a family. He marries Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow, on January 6, 1759. The marriage brings him both companionship and considerable property, including slaves and valuable lands. He settles into life at Mount Vernon, the plantation on the Potomac that he has inherited from his half-brother Lawrence. For the next 15 years, he focuses on making Mount Vernon profitable. He experiments with crops, tries to reduce dependence on tobacco. He expands his land holdings. He serves in Virginia's House of Burgesses, building political connections and understanding colonial governance. To all appearances, he is content to live out his days as a prosperous Virginia planter. But beneath the surface, something is shifting. British policies after the French and Indian War, new taxes, restrictions on Western expansion, increasing assertions of parliamentary authority, create growing resentment throughout the colonies. Washington shares this resentment. His experience as a military officer has shown him how little respect Britain has for colonial soldiers. His economic interests are threatened by British trade restrictions, and his pride, always a powerful force in his character, chafes at being treated as a second-class subject of the crown. The unanimous choice. June 1775. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress grapples with an impossible situation. Massachusetts militiamen and British regulars have already exchanged fire at Lexington and Concord. Boston is under siege. The colonies are sliding toward open rebellion, yet most delegates still hope for reconciliation with Britain. They need someone to command the gathering Continental Army, someone with military experience, political acumen, and the ability to unite 13 fractious colonies. George Washington attends the Congress in his old Virginia militia uniform. The gesture is not accidental. Among the delegates, he alone has significant military command experience. He is a Southerner, which balances the New England origin of the current crisis. He is wealthy enough to be considered responsible, yet not so aristocratic as to seem threatening to Republican ideals. And crucially, he carries himself with a gravitas that suggests competence and reliability. On June 15th, he is unanimously elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. His acceptance speech reveals his understanding of the magnitude of what lies ahead. He refuses to accept a salary, asking only that his expenses be reimbursed. He expresses doubt about his qualifications for such responsibility. But he accepts, because to refuse would be to abandon the cause at its most critical moment. When he arrives at Cambridge to take command of the forces besieging Boston, he finds not an army but a mob. Approximately 16,000 men, mostly New England farmers and tradesmen, sit in camps surrounding the city. They lack uniforms, discipline, training, and often weapons. Officers are elected by their men and command little respect. Sanitation is primitive. Organization is nearly non-existent. Many enlistments will expire at year's end, meaning the entire force could simply dissolve and go home. Washington sets to work transforming this rabble into something approximating a military force. He establishes chains of command, enforces discipline, demands accountability from officers. He pushes Congress for proper equipment and supplies, a frustrating, ongoing struggle that will last throughout the war. Most importantly, he begins to understand that this will not be a short conflict. Britain's advantages in troops, equipment, and naval power are overwhelming. The Continental Army cannot win through conventional battlefield victories. It must survive, adapt, and wait for British will to break. The long defeat. The war's early years are a catalog of disasters barely survived. After the British evacuate Boston in March 1776, Washington moves his forces to defend New York City. In August, British forces land on Long Island with overwhelming strength. Washington's defensive positions are outflanked, his forces routed. Only a nighttime evacuation across the East River, aided by fog and the skill of Massachusetts fishermen, saves the army from complete destruction. Through the fall of 1776, British forces push Washington's army across New Jersey in a fighting retreat. Men desert by the hundreds. Enlistments expire. Supplies run out. By December, Washington commands fewer than 3,000 effective troops, and most of those are set to go home when the year ends. The revolution appears finished. On Christmas night, 1776, in a desperate gamble, Washington leads his forces across the ice-choked Delaware River. The operation nearly fails. Several boats do not make it across, eliminating nearly a third of his attack force. But before dawn on December 26th, the remaining troops fall upon the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The surprise is complete. The victory is decisive. A week later, Washington strikes again at Princeton, routing British forces and capturing valuable supplies. These are small victories in military terms, mere tactical successes against minor positions. But psychologically, they are transformative. They prove the Continental Army can win. They revitalize recruitment. They convince the French that American resistance might actually succeed. And they establish Washington's reputation as a commander who will not quit, who will find ways to strike back even from the edge of defeat. The grinding years. The winter at Valley Forge, 1777 to 1778, becomes emblematic of the Army's suffering. 20 miles from Philadelphia, where British forces occupy the capital in comfort, Washington's army huddles in log huts through months of bitter cold. Food is scarce. Clothing is inadequate. Disease ravages the camps. Men's feet freeze in the snow, not from marching, but from simply standing guard. The phrase, "no army, no country," appears repeatedly in Washington's correspondence during these months. He knows that if this force dissolves, American independence dissolves with it. But Valley Forge also marks a turning point. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, arrives and begins drilling the troops in European military tactics. The army that emerges from Valley Forge is more disciplined, better trained, more capable of standing in formation against British regulars. And in June 1778, news arrives that France has formally allied with the United States. The war is no longer just a colonial rebellion. It has become a global conflict that threatens British interest from India to the Caribbean. The next 3 years test Washington's patience more than his courage. Major battles are rare. The British shift their focus to the southern colonies. Washington's army, stationed primarily in New York and New Jersey, can do little to affect events in Georgia and the Carolinas. He must hold his force together, maintaining discipline, preventing mutinies, begging Congress and the states for supplies and pay, while watching the war's momentum shift southward. His correspondence from these years reveals growing frustration. The states, jealous of their sovereignty, refuse to provide adequate support. Congress, perpetually broke, cannot pay the soldiers or supply the army properly. Officers threaten to resign. Enlisted men threaten mutiny. And through it all, Washington must project confidence, must maintain the appearance of an army, even when that army is more aspiration than reality. Yorktown. In the summer of 1781, opportunity finally arrives. British General Cornwallis, after campaigning through the Carolinas, establishes his army at Yorktown, Virginia, on a peninsula between the York and James rivers. He expects the Royal Navy to maintain his supply lines and provide evacuation if necessary. Washington, coordinating with French General Rochambeau and French Admiral de Grasse, sees a chance to trap him. The logistics are staggering. Washington must move his army and French forces 400 miles south from New York without alerting British commanders. French naval forces must arrive at exactly the right moment to control Chesapeake Bay. Supply trains must be organized. Siege equipment must be transported. Any breakdown in coordination will give Cornwallis time to escape or receive reinforcement. By late September, the trap closes. French ships defeat a British relief fleet, controlling the Chesapeake. Allied forces, approximately 17,000 strong, surround Cornwallis's 8,000 defenders. Siege trenches are dug, artillery positioned. Washington himself fires the first American cannon. For 3 weeks, bombardment reduces British positions systematically. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders. The moment of triumph is surprisingly subdued. Washington accepts the surrender with formal courtesy. There is relief, certainly, and satisfaction, but no wild celebration. He understands that the war is not officially over. British forces still occupy New York and Charleston. Negotiations for peace will take years. But effectively, this is the decisive victory. Britons will to continue fighting a land war in America has been broken. Independence is no longer a dream, but an inevitability. The Cincinnatus moment. December 23, 1783. In the Maryland State House at Annapolis, George Washington appears before Congress to resign his commission as Commander-in-Chief. The war has been over for months. The British have evacuated. American independence is secured. But this moment carries weight beyond the mere formality of a military resignation. Throughout history, victorious generals have used armies to seize political power. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Cromwell dissolved Parliament. The pattern is well established. Military success breeds political ambition, and armed forces ensure that ambition succeeds. Many expect Washington to follow this path. Some even want him to. After the war, disgruntled officers, angry over unpaid wages, hint at military coup. They suggest Washington should become king. The letters arrive at his headquarters, carefully worded, testing his response. Washington's rejection is absolute. In March 1783, at Newburgh, New York, he confronts officers considering rebellion against Congress. His speech is carefully prepared. He appeals to their patriotism, their honor, their sense of history. Then, as he begins reading a letter from a congressman, he pauses. He reaches into his pocket and withdraws spectacles. "Gentlemen," he says, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." It is a simple human moment. Many officers are moved to tears. The crisis passes. Now, in Annapolis, he completes the act. He reads a brief statement, thanks Congress for its support, and formally surrenders his commission. Then he leaves, traveling immediately to Mount Vernon. He arrives home on Christmas Eve. He has been away, with brief interruptions, for 8.5 years. He is 51 years old. He intends to retire. The impact of this resignation reverberates across the Atlantic world. King George III, when told that Washington intends to return his farm rather than seize power, reportedly says, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. The act establishes a precedent that will define American civil-military relations. The military is subordinate to civilian authority, and personal power must be voluntarily surrendered when duty is complete. The troubled peace. But retirement brings no peace. From Mount Vernon, Washington watches the new nation struggle. The Articles of Confederation, the framework governing the United States, proves woefully inadequate. Congress cannot raise taxes or regulate trade. States print their own currencies, erect trade barriers against each other, refuse to honor debts. In Massachusetts, armed farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, rise in rebellion against state tax collectors. Shays' rebellion is suppressed, but the underlying problems remain. Washington's correspondence from these years reveals deep concern. He fought for 8 years to create an independent nation. Now, that nation appears to be dissolving from internal weakness. Foreign powers, Britain, Spain, even former ally France, watch with predatory interest, ready to exploit American divisions. Something must change, or the revolution's achievements will be lost. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states gather in Philadelphia, ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation. Washington attends as Virginia's delegate and is immediately elected president of the convention. His presence lends the proceedings legitimacy. His silence during debates, he rarely speaks, preferring to preside rather than participate, allows other delegates to argue the details while he maintains the dignity of the assembly. What emerges from the convention is not a revision of the Articles, but an entirely new framework, the Constitution of the United States. It creates a strong central government with powers to tax, regulate commerce, and enforce laws. It balances state and federal authority through a complex system of checks and balances. And it creates an executive office, the presidency, with powers both broad and deliberately vague. Everyone understands that George Washington will be the first president. The office is designed with him in mind. Delegates trust that he will establish proper precedents, will use power responsibly, will step down when his service is complete. Without that trust, without Washington, the Constitution might never have been ratified. Several state conventions approved the document by narrow margins, and many delegates cite Washington's expected leadership as reason for their support. The weight of precedent. April 30th, 1789. The inauguration. The oath. The transformation from private citizen to president. But when the ceremony ends, when the crowds disperse, when Washington enters the presidential residence in New York City, he confronts a daunting reality. He must now define what the presidency actually means. The Constitution provides outline, not detail. How should the president address Congress? How formal should the office be? Should there be elaborate ceremony, like European courts or Republican simplicity? How should the president interact with citizens? With foreign ambassadors? With his own cabinet? Every decision sets a precedent. Every action will be studied and either replicated or rejected by future presidents. Washington approaches these questions with characteristic caution. He seeks advice, consults widely, moves deliberately. He settles on a middle path between monarchical formality and democratic casualness. He will hold formal receptions, but avoid excessive ceremony. He will be addressed as Mr. President, rather than more grandiose titles some suggest. He will maintain dignity without aristocratic pretension. He assembles a cabinet of exceptional talent and dangerous egos. Thomas Jefferson becomes Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton, his former aide-de-camp, becomes Secretary of the Treasury. Henry Knox, who served as artillery chief during the Revolution, becomes Secretary of War. Edmund Randolph becomes Attorney General. It is a team designed to represent different regions and different political philosophies. Washington believes he can manage their disagreements, using their collective wisdom to chart the best course forward. He is, in this assumption, both right and catastrophically wrong. Building the nation's foundations. Hamilton moves quickly and boldly. As Treasury Secretary, he proposes that the federal government assume all state debts from the Revolutionary War. This is controversial. States that have already paid their debts resent being taxed to pay others' obligations. But Hamilton argues that assumption will establish federal credit, create a bond market, and demonstrate that the United States honors its commitments. After intense negotiation, including a famous dinner where Jefferson and Madison agree to support assumption in exchange for placing the national capital on the Potomac, the plan passes. Hamilton follows with proposals for a national bank, federal excise taxes, and tariffs to support domestic manufacturing. Each proposal sparks fierce debate. Jefferson and his allies argue that Hamilton's vision creates dangerous centralization of power, favors commercial interests over agricultural ones, and violates the Constitution's limits on federal authority. Hamilton counters that a strong, financially stable central government is essential for national survival in a dangerous world. Washington, listening to both sides, generally supports Hamilton's programs. not because he particularly loves banks or excise taxes, but because he believes national strength requires financial credibility and economic development. The nation must pay its debts, maintain its credit, and create conditions for prosperity. His support proves decisive. Congress, closely divided on these issues, follows the president's lead more often than not. But the political cost is significant. The debates over Hamilton's policies begin to crystallize into organized factions. Jefferson and Madison build a political network, eventually called Democratic Republicans, opposing Hamilton's monarchical tendencies. Hamilton and his allies, later known as Federalists, advocate for energetic central government and close ties with Britain. Washington, who views political parties as dangerous to national unity, finds himself increasingly associated with the Federalist faction simply because he supports their policies. Foreign affairs and domestic fury. In 1793, France executes King Louis XVI and declares war on Britain and other European powers. The news electrifies America. Many Americans, remembering French assistance during the Revolution, want to support France. Jefferson and his allies see the French Revolution as extending the republican principles America established. But Hamilton and the Federalists, horrified by revolutionary violence and fearful of war with Britain, counsel neutrality. Washington issues a neutrality proclamation, declaring that the United States will remain impartial in European conflicts. The decision is strategically sound. America is militarily weak, economically fragile, and cannot afford war with any major power. But it is politically divisive. Critics accuse Washington of abandoning America's ally and betraying revolutionary principles. Democratic-Republican newspapers, which have proliferated in recent years, attack the president with a viciousness that shocks him. He had expected respect, deference, recognition of his service and sacrifice. Instead, he reads accusations that he is a wannabe monarch, a tool of British interests, even, incredibly, a corrupt embezzler of public funds. The attacks wound him deeply. He, who refused a salary during the Revolution, who has always prized his reputation above all else, must endure public character assassination from fellow Americans. The partisan divide deepens. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 further polarizes the nation. Western Pennsylvania farmers, angered by Hamilton's excise tax on whiskey, organize armed resistance against federal tax collectors. Washington, seeing the rebellion as a direct challenge to federal authority, calls out militia forces and leads them personally into western Pennsylvania. The rebellion collapses without major violence, but the episode reinforces partisan narratives. To Federalists, it proves that strong government is necessary to maintain order. To Democratic Republicans, it demonstrates federal overreach and military intimidation of citizens. The Jay Treaty Crisis. In 1794, Washington sends Chief Justice John Jay to Britain to negotiate outstanding issues between the two nations. British forces still occupy western forts on American soil. British warships stop American vessels and impress American sailors into the Royal Navy. American merchants want compensation for seized cargoes. Tensions are rising toward potential war. Jay returns with a treaty that addresses some issues but concedes on others. Britain agrees to evacuate the western forts but offers little on impressment or merchant compensation. The treaty grants Britain most favored nation trading status while restricting American trade with British colonies. When the treaty's terms become public, reaction is explosive. Democratic Republicans denounce it as a surrender to British interests. Mobs burn Jay in effigy. Hamilton is stoned by a crowd in New York when he tries to defend the treaty publicly. Washington receives the most venomous criticism of his entire presidency. He is accused of betraying the nation, of preferring British monarchy to American republicanism, of dishonoring the Revolutionary War sacrifices. Washington, after long deliberation, submits the treaty to the Senate. He does not love it. He sees its weaknesses clearly, but he believes it accomplishes the essential goal, avoiding war with Britain while American power grows. The Senate, by the barest constitutional majority, approves the treaty. The House, controlled by Democratic Republicans, initially refuses to appropriate funds for implementation but eventually yields when Washington firmly asserts executive authority in foreign affairs. The Jay Treaty crisis marks the low point of Washington's presidency. The reverence that once surrounded him has eroded. Partisan conflict has destroyed the unity he prized. He is tired, hurt, eager to return to Mount Vernon. By 1796, he has definitively decided not to seek a third term. The Farewell. September 19, 1796. Washington's farewell address appears in Philadelphia's American Daily Advertiser. It is not delivered as a speech, but published as a letter to the American people. Much of it is written by Hamilton, though Washington heavily edits and contributes his own thoughts. The document is both reflection and warning. He explains his decision to retire, noting that the presidency was never meant to be a lifetime position. He warns against the dangers of excessive partisanship, of geographical divisions between North and South, of permanent foreign alliances that might entangle America in European wars. He advocates for national unity, for subordination of regional interests to the common good, for vigilance against threats to constitutional government. The address does not immediately become the sacred text it later represents. Democratic Republicans view it as a Federalist political document. But over time, its warnings resonate. Washington's fear of partisan division, his insistence that the Constitution must be respected even by those who disagree with specific policies, his vision of American independence from European power struggles. These become foundational principles of American political culture. On March 4, 1797, he attends John Adams's inauguration as second president. Then he departs immediately from Mount Vernon. After 8 years as president, after decades of public service, he is finally, truly going home. He is 65 years old. His health, never robust in recent years, is declining. He has perhaps 3 years left, but he has accomplished what seemed impossible. He has established the American presidency as an office of limited power, guided by law, and peacefully transferred to a successor. In doing so, he has given the Republic its best chance of survival. Mount Vernon's call. He returns to Mount Vernon with relief that borders on joy. The presidency has aged him. His correspondence with friends reveals not triumph, but exhaustion, not satisfaction, but weariness at partisan attacks and endless responsibilities. He wants only to manage his farms, ride his lands, enjoy his family, and fade from public memory into private peace. Mount Vernon requires attention. 8 years of absence, even with overseers managing daily operations, has taken its toll. Fields need rotation. Buildings need repair. The distillery he has established needs oversight. He throws himself into agricultural work with the same methodical intensity he once applied to military and political challenges. His daily routine involves rising before dawn, riding across his 5 farms to inspect operations, returning for breakfast, managing correspondence, and then more riding until evening. But the world will not let him rest completely. He remains the most famous man in America, possibly in the Western world. Visitors arrive constantly at Mount Vernon. Dignitaries, old soldiers, politicians seeking advice, admirers simply wanting to meet the great man. Washington receives them with courtesy, but increasing fatigue. He never turns anyone away, but the constant interruptions prevent the true retirement he craves. Political events continue to demand his attention. Relations with France deteriorate. The French government, angered by the Jay Treaty and believing America has abandoned its revolutionary ally, begins seizing American ships. By 1798, an undeclared naval war, the Quasi-War, is underway. President Adams asks Washington to resume command of the army in case of French invasion. Washington, now 66 years old and in declining health, reluctantly agrees. He never actually takes the field. The crisis passes without full-scale war. But the request demonstrates that even in retirement, he remains the symbol of national unity and strength. The final December. December 1799. Winter settles over Mount Vernon. Washington, despite his age and recent illness, continues his daily routine. On December 12th, he rides out to inspect his farms. The weather is poor: snow, sleet, cold rain. He stays out for hours, returning to Mount Vernon soaked and chilled. He does not change clothes immediately, not wanting to keep dinner waiting. It is a small decision, the kind of minor discomfort a strong man might brush off. By the next morning, he is ill. His throat is painfully sore. Breathing becomes difficult. His personal physician, Dr. James Craik, who has known Washington since the French and Indian War, is summoned. Two other physicians arrive. They apply the standard treatments of the era: bloodletting, blistering, purges. They remove nearly half his blood over the course of the day, believing this will restore balance to his system. It does not. It weakens him catastrophically. Throughout December 14th, Washington's condition worsens. His throat swells. Breathing becomes increasingly laborious. He remains conscious, aware that he is dying. He faces death as he faced everything else, with stoic dignity. He instructs his secretary about his will. He apologizes to the doctors for the trouble he is causing them. To Martha, his wife of 40 years, he speaks with tenderness and practical concern about funeral arrangements. As evening approaches, he asks that no one try to revive him if he stops breathing. He does not want a heroic death. He has had enough of heroism. As darkness settles over Mount Vernon, as the first hours of December 15th begin, George Washington dies. He is 67 years old. The news spreads slowly at first, then with gathering speed. By late December, the nation knows. Congress, despite partisan divisions that would have appalled Washington, unites in mourning. Representative Henry Lee, Washington's old comrade-in-arms, delivers the most famous eulogy: first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Mock funerals are held in cities across the nation and in European capitals. Napoleon Bonaparte orders 10 days of mourning in France, honoring a fellow revolutionary despite current political tensions. Martha Washington never fully recovers from his death. She survives him by less than 3 years, dying in May 1802. They are buried together at Mount Vernon, in a tomb overlooking the Potomac, as Washington specified in his will. The immediate canonization. In the years immediately following Washington's death, something remarkable occurs. The man becomes myth. His flaws are forgotten or recast as virtues. His mistakes are erased from popular memory. His very real human complexity, the ambition, the touchiness about honor, the ruthless streak that served him well in war, disappears beneath layers of hagiography. The Parson Weems biography, published in 1800 and wildly successful, invents whole episodes. The cherry tree story, I cannot tell a lie, never happened. The prayer at Valley Forge, portrayed in countless paintings, is likely apocryphal. The throwing of the silver dollar across the Potomac is physically impossible. But truth matters less than what the nation needs Washington to represent. Perfect virtue, absolute honesty, selfless service. This mythologizing served a purpose. The United States, in the early 1800s, is fragile. Partisan divisions remain fierce. The Constitution's survival is not guaranteed. The peaceful transfer of power from Adams to Jefferson in 1801, the first such transfer between opposing parties in modern history, succeeds partly because both sides claim Washington's legacy. He becomes the common ground, the shared father figure, the proof that American republicanism can work. As decades pass, as the generation that knew Washington personally dies off, the myth solidifies further. He becomes the founding father, the indispensable man, the figure without whom American independence and constitutional government would have failed. Historians debate this characterization, arguing that historical forces, not individual men, drive events. But the popular imagination rejects such analysis. Americans want to believe that one man's character can change history. Washington provides that belief. The complicated inheritance. But Washington's legacy contains contradictions that become increasingly difficult to ignore. He is celebrated as a champion of liberty who owned enslaved human beings. He is praised for establishing peaceful democratic traditions while suppressing domestic dissent with military force. He is honored for voluntarily relinquishing power while establishing precedents of executive authority that future presidents expand far beyond his practice. The slavery question particularly troubles his legacy. At his death, Washington owned 123 enslaved people outright and controlled another 153 who belonged to the Custis estate. His will frees his own slaves upon Martha's death, making him the only major founder to provide for general emancipation. But this act, progressive for its time, cannot erase decades of participating in and profiting from slavery. Modern assessments struggle with this duality. The man who fought for American liberty never extended that principle to people he held in bondage. His attitudes toward Native Americans also complicate his legacy. As president, Washington pursued a policy of cultural assimilation and, when that failed, military subjugation. The 1790s see devastating campaigns against native tribes in the Ohio country. Washington approves these operations, believing Western expansion essential to American prosperity and security. From native perspectives, Washington is not a founding father, but a founding enemy, the architect of policies that lead to displacement and cultural destruction. His precedence as president proved double-edged. His assertion of executive authority in foreign affairs, his use of military force to suppress domestic resistance, his creation of a cabinet system. These precedents enable effective governance. But they also enable future presidents to expand executive power in ways Washington might not have approved. The imperial presidency of later centuries traces some of its lineage to precedents Washington established, however cautiously. The Eternal Father. Despite these complications, or perhaps because of them, Washington remains central to American identity. His image appears on currency, monuments, countless schools and towns, and geographic features. The nation's capital bears his name. His birthday becomes a federal holiday. Every president invokes his example, claiming to follow his principles even while pursuing policies Washington might not recognize. Different eras emphasize different aspects of his legacy. In the 19th century, he is primarily the military hero who won independence. In the early 20th century, emphasis shifts to his role as constitutional founder and president. In recent decades, focus turns toward his complexity, the flawed human being who nevertheless rose to meet extraordinary challenges. Scholars debate his true significance endlessly. Was he a great man who shaped history, or merely a competent leader whom historical forces elevated? Did his character determine events, or did events reveal character that would have remained unremarkable in ordinary times? These questions have no definitive answers, but they miss something essential about Washington's achievement. He understood, better than most of his contemporaries, that character is performative, that what matters is not just what you are, but what you appear to be and how that appearance shapes others' behavior. He constructed himself deliberately, projecting qualities, dignity, steadiness, incorruptibility, that inspired trust even when his actual capabilities were limited. He understood that symbols matter, that precedents matter, that the appearance of unity and stability can create actual unity and stability. This might seem like mere theatricality, but it was much more. Washington's gift was recognizing that the American Republic was fragile, that it survived only as long as key actors believed in it and acted accordingly. So he performed the role of the incorruptible leader, and in performing it, made it real. His voluntary surrender of power was not natural or inevitable. It was a deliberate choice to establish a precedent that would bind future leaders. And remarkably, that precedent held. What he accomplished, by any reasonable measure, George Washington's achievements are extraordinary. He commanded Continental forces through 8 years of desperate warfare against the world's premier military power and won. He presided over the Constitutional Convention and used his prestige to secure ratification. He served 8 years as president, establishing precedents that define the office to this day. And crucially, He surrendered power twice, after the Revolution and after his presidency, when he could plausibly have kept it. The military achievement alone is remarkable. Washington was not a brilliant tactical commander. He lost more battles than he won. His mistakes, particularly in the New York campaign, could have ended the Revolution in 1776. But he possessed strategic vision and unbreakable persistence. He understood that the Continental Army's survival was more important than battlefield victories, that British will could be broken through endurance and strategic patience. His ability to hold together a starving, unpaid, poorly equipped army for 8 years demonstrates leadership of the highest order. His political achievements matter even more. The Constitution might have been written without him, but it almost certainly would not have been ratified. Multiple state conventions approved by narrow margins, with delegates explicitly citing trust in Washington's expected leadership. His presidency, though often frustrating and ending in partisan acrimony, established essential precedents: cabinet government, federal financial authority, judicial independence, civilian control of the military, and most importantly, the peaceful transfer of power to an elected successor. The voluntary surrender of power cannot be overstated. In the 18th century, this was extraordinary behavior. Successful generals became kings, emperors, dictators. They did not return to farming. Washington's choice to do so, twice, established a precedent that has survived, with one brief horrific exception, for nearly 2.5 centuries. Every American president who has peacefully left office traces that tradition back to Washington's example. What he failed to do, but achievement must be weighed against failure. Washington could have used his enormous prestige to push for slavery's gradual abolition. He did not. He freed his own slaves only upon his death, and even that freedom was structured to occur after Martha's death, a provision that Martha, fearing for her own safety from enslaved people who might benefit from her death, effectively overrode by freeing them early. He never publicly advocated for emancipation. He never challenged the constitutional compromises that protected slavery. His silence on the greatest moral issue of his age remains damning. His policies toward Native Americans, while typical for his era, initiated displacement and cultural destruction that continued for a century. He pursued westward expansion aggressively, understanding that American prosperity depended on access to Western lands. That this required dispossessing existing inhabitants troubled him little. His vision of America had no real place for Native peoples as equal participants. At best, he hoped for their assimilation. At worst, he authorized military campaigns that destroyed Native communities and cultures. He could not prevent the rise of political parties, despite viewing them as dangerous to Republican government. His farewell address warnings about partisanship proved futile. The partisan divisions of his presidency intensified under his successors, leading eventually to the Civil War. The conflict that exposed the fundamental contradictions in the American founding that Washington had helped construct but never resolved. He built much of his personal wealth through land speculation in territory taken from Native peoples and through the labor of enslaved human beings. His Mount Vernon plantation, so carefully managed and beloved by him, was built on unrecompensed suffering. His financial security, which gave him the independence to refuse presidential salary and maintain political independence, rested on foundations of injustice. The paradox of character. Washington's character contains puzzling contradictions. He was genuinely humble about his abilities. His private correspondence reveals constant self-doubt, yet extremely sensitive about his reputation and quick to perceive slights to his honor. He was personally generous to friends and subordinates, yet could be coldly ruthless toward enemies or those who failed him. He claimed a long for private life, yet repeatedly accepted public office. He presented himself as above political faction while generally supporting Federalist policies and appointments. He was not particularly intellectual. Unlike Jefferson, Madison, or Hamilton, he was not a political philosopher. He read less, wrote more plainly, thought more practically. His education was limited, his formal knowledge of history and political theory fragmentary. Yet he possessed practical wisdom that more learned men often lacked. He understood how organizations work, how to delegate authority, how to maintain discipline without destroying initiative, how to project authority that inspires confidence. He was not particularly charismatic. He gave few memorable speeches. He rarely displayed strong emotion in public. He maintained formality that could seem cold or distant. Yet people followed him through disasters that would have destroyed other leaders. His officers remained loyal despite years of unpaid service. His soldiers endured incredible hardships without mutiny. Political opponents, while attacking his policies, rarely attacked his integrity. Something in his bearing commanded respect and trust even from those who disagreed with him. Perhaps the key to this paradox lies in his self-awareness. Washington understood his limitations. He knew he was not the most brilliant man in any room. So he compensated through preparation, consultation, and careful consideration. He made himself appear more capable than he perhaps was through study, dignity, and emotional control. And remarkably, the performance became real. By consistently acting like a man of perfect integrity and sound judgment, he developed those qualities. The question of indispensability. Historians debate whether Washington was truly indispensable. Could someone else have commanded the Continental Army to victory? Could the Constitution have been ratified without him? Could the presidency have been successfully established by another first president? These counterfactual questions have no certain answers, but they matter for understanding Washington's true significance. The military question seems answerable. Probably not. Other commanders, perhaps Nathaniel Greene or Henry Knox, might have managed competently, but would they have maintained political support through the darkest years? Would Congress and the states have continued funding an army led by anyone else? Would British will have broken as completely facing a different commander? Washington's prestige was crucial to maintaining American will to continue fighting. Someone else might have won individual battles, but the 8-year campaign required Washington's unique combination of strategic vision, political skill, and symbolic importance. The constitutional question is more complex. The convention would have occurred without Washington. The problems with the Articles of Confederation were too severe to ignore. But ratification, particularly in key states like Virginia and New York, might have failed without trust in Washington's expected leadership. The Constitution created a powerful executive office that many feared could become tyrannical. Only confidence that Washington would not abuse presidential power made that risk acceptable. Someone else, as first president, might have established different, potentially destructive precedents. But even if we grant Washington's indispensability for the Revolution and Constitution, does that make him a great man or merely a fortunate one? Was he elevated by circumstances, or did he rise to meet them through force of character? The answer is probably both. He was not born great. His early military career showed competence, but also serious mistakes. His education and intellect were unremarkable. But when extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary leadership, he developed the capacity to provide it. The greatness was real, but it was constructed, built through discipline, study, and conscious self-fashioning, rather than innate. The lesson of limits. Perhaps Washington's most important legacy is about the limits of power. He could have been king. The army would have followed him. Many citizens would have supported it. Yet he refused, not because he lacked ambition. He clearly possessed it, but because he understood that creating a sustainable republic required leaders to subordinate personal ambition to institutional stability. This lesson resonates beyond his specific historical moment. Every society faces the question, how do you prevent leaders from becoming tyrants? Constitutional checks and balances help. Democratic accountability helps. But ultimately, the republic survives only if leaders choose to respect its norms even when violating them would be personally advantageous. Washington chose respect. That choice, repeated by most of his successors, has sustained American democracy far longer than most 18th century observers expected possible. But the lesson has a darker side. Washington's voluntary limits applied primarily to formal political power. He was quite comfortable with economic power derived from slavery and land speculation. He saw no contradiction between republican virtue in politics and aristocratic privilege in economics. This limited understanding of equality, political without economic, has shaped American development profoundly. The United States achieved political democracy while maintaining economic hierarchies that undermine democratic ideals. Washington's legacy includes both the democratic achievement and its limitations. Measuring the man. 2 centuries after his death, how should we measure George Washington? Not as the marble statue, the impossibly virtuous founder of patriotic myth. That Washington never existed. The real man was flawed, limited, complicit in great injustices. He owned enslaved people. He dispossessed native peoples. He built his fortune on systems of exploitation. No amount of political achievement erases these moral failures. Yet neither should we dismiss his accomplishments through retrospective moral judgment. Washington operated within the constraints and assumptions of his time. He was in many ways better than most of his contemporaries. He eventually freed his slaves. He attempted to negotiate fairly with some native tribes. He genuinely believed in republican government. These actions, insufficient by modern standards, represented real choices against the norms of his society. The tension between these perspectives, Washington as moral failure by modern standards, Washington as relatively progressive by 18th century standards, cannot be resolved. We must hold both truths simultaneously. He was a man of his time who participated in great wrongs. He was also a leader who made crucial choices that enabled democratic governance to survive and spread. Both statements are true. Both matter. What remains remarkable is not Washington's perfection. He was far from perfect, but his consciousness of his historical role. He understood that his actions would establish precedents for generations. This consciousness shaped his behavior. He chose, repeatedly, to prioritize institutional stability over personal power. That choice was not inevitable. It was deliberate, and it mattered. The unfinished legacy. Washington's legacy remains unfinished. The nation he helped create still grapples with contradictions he never resolved. How can we reconcile liberty with equality? How do we balance federal power with state autonomy? How do we honor rights while maintaining order? These questions, debated in Washington's time, remain contested today. The institutions he helped establish have evolved far beyond anything he imagined. The presidency, which he kept deliberately constrained, has grown into an office of immense power. The federal government, which he helped create as a limited entity, regulates vast swaths of American life. The nation, which in his time extended only to the Mississippi River, spans a continent and projects power globally. Whether he would approve of these developments is unknowable and ultimately irrelevant. History does not wait for founders' approval. What persists is the framework he helped establish: constitutional government, civilian control of military, peaceful transfer of power, federal system balancing national and state authority. These principles, tested repeatedly, have survived. They have been bent, stretched, sometimes nearly broken, but the core framework endures. That is Washington's gift. Not perfect institutions, but durable ones. Not solutions to every problem, but structures resilient enough to adapt to challenges he could not have imagined. The final accounting. If George Washington returned today and examined the nation he helped create, what would he think? He would likely find much shocking. The scale, the diversity, the technology, the social changes. The America of the 21st century bears little resemblance to the agrarian republic of his time. The population alone, over 330 million people compared to fewer than 4 million in his era, would stagger him. But beneath the surface changes, he might recognize something essential. The Constitution still governs. Presidents still take the oath he first recited. Congress still debates. Courts still adjudicate. The military remains under civilian control. Power still transfers peacefully between elected leaders. The Republic survives. That survival, improbable in 1789, represents his most lasting achievement. He would also confront the ongoing consequences of his failures. Racial inequality, rooted in the slavery he participated in, remains a defining American challenge. The displacement of native peoples, which his policies advanced, leaves scars across the national landscape. Economic inequality, which he did not see as problematic, shapes American life profoundly. These problems trace directly to choices made in his era, choices he endorsed or accepted. The full measure of Washington's life, then, is mixed. Extraordinary achievement coexisting with profound moral failure. Crucial service alongside comfortable complicity with injustice. Genuine humility mixed with aristocratic privilege. Vision for the future combined with blindness to his own contradictions. He was neither saint nor monster, neither hero nor villain. He was a human being who faced extraordinary challenges and met some while failing others. The final word. On that December night in 1799, as breath left George Washington's body for the last time, what might he have thought? We cannot know, but we can imagine. Perhaps he felt satisfaction at having served as best he could. Perhaps regret for opportunities missed or mistakes made. Perhaps simply relief that the long burden of public service finally ended. What he could not have known was how completely his choices would shape the centuries that followed. The precedents he set, voluntary surrender of power, presidential dignity without monarchy, respect for constitutional limits, became foundational to American governance. His failures on slavery, on native rights, on economic inequality, cast equally long shadows. He was, ultimately, a man who understood the weight of history and chose to bear it. Not perfectly, not without cost, but with sufficient wisdom and restraint to give an improbable experiment in Republican government its best chance of success. The experiment continues, still unfinished, still flawed, still striving toward ideals its founders proclaimed, but imperfectly practiced. Perhaps that is the truest measure of George Washington. Not that he created perfection, but that he created space for future generations to continue the work. The republic he helped establish remains, 2.25 centuries later, still struggling with the same fundamental questions: how to balance liberty and order, freedom and equality, individual rights and collective good. He did not answer these questions definitively, but he built a framework strong enough to contain the ongoing debate. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Not heroic perfection, not moral clarity, but sufficient wisdom and sufficient restraint to launch a fragile experiment that, against all odds, survived. The man was flawed. The achievement was real. Both truths endure. And so George Washington remains. First in war, first in peace, and forever first in the complex, contradictory, unfinished story of the American experiment. Neither saint nor demon, neither perfect nor villainous. Simply a man who, when history called, answered, and in answering, changed the world.